Hannah, thank you again for joining. Let's start with a really important question, of which I would love both of you to answer. Jesse, we'll start with you. Why should we care about malt?
Well, it's the foundation of flavor in beer. Without it, you wouldn't have beer. I mean, it's really important, and it's often overlooked, like you said. But there's a lot of cool things happening in the malt world too that a lot of people may not be aware of, in craft malt specifically. So I would say yes, you need to care because this is important. It's adding to the flavor and so much more in the beer.
Hannah, from your perspective, someone who studies and works in research around it, what is the answer to this question for you? Why should we care about barley and malt?
Well, there's a couple reasons for me. I mean, Jesse definitely hits on an important part. Malt is a big aspect of what your beer is. But for me, there's two other really important aspects. Outside of the flavor, the actual process of making beer is reliant on there being sugar there to be able to ferment for your alcohol. And you can't get that if you have just starch. Malted barley is really important for the enzymatic side. There's also some aspects about the hull that help with your filtration. So malted barley is really a big component of the process that allows brewing to happen. The other part for me is that brewers are getting more and more localized and supporting their community. And barley is a big value chain that starts with a farmer, involves a maltster, and there's researchers in the background like ourselves. And so being involved in your community by being aware of where your malt is coming from, you're including a big part of that community just through the value chain of barley.
Can you both talk a little bit about what that means when you mention the value chain? Hannah, we'll stay with you since you bring it up. The I guess the places where hands are touching it, it's passing along from field to glass. Can you maybe go a little bit deeper in what you mean exactly?
Sure. So one way that I like to think of it is, really that's going to start back with the breeder. So our program, we've got a barley breeding program that's been around for decades. And what barley starts as, like the new varieties that are a decade out from here, they start as an idea. And so Jamie Sherman, she's our breeder at Montana State University. She has something that she knows brewers need, or that, agriculturally, agronomically, there's some need that needs to be filled. And so it starts with the idea of that. And so she starts by collecting barley varieties from germplasm, seed banks, sources all over the world. And her goal is to create as much variation as possible so that when she makes those crosses, the hope is that you'll have the ideal collection of genetics come together for a variety that will be released. From there forward, it's all about selection. So from that first cross where we've got as much variation as possible, all the way down to the beer in your glass. It's all about selecting down to make something that's more consistent. So throughout the 10 to 12 years of the breeding program, we're making selections that's heading towards whatever that end goal originally started as. So then we release a variety a decade later. It goes to the farmer. They have variation in their own system, whether it's year to year, environmental variation, field to field, landscape variation, fertility variation, all kinds of things that they're trying to manage to create a consistent barley that then the maltster can take into their system and then manage their variability. So the maltster then has seasonal variation of temperature, the water variation, the variety that they're working with, the protein levels that they're working with, all of that variation that they take their system and do the dials and levers that they can and try and create a malt that's going to be consistent for the brewer. And then, probably where you guys are most aware of the brewing process, you're again taking a product that is in relevance of variable product and trying to make a beer that's consistent, because when that consumer comes into the bar, they're going to be expecting that the beer that they've come to know and love is going to be the same every time. And so that value chain is about this community of people that are working together. We all have the mentality of quality that we're after. We all have the mentality of consistency. And it takes all of us to create that beer for that final product.
Hannah, I got a quick question to follow up there, Jesse. Then feel free to chime in after Hannah shares on this, because Hannah, the way that you're talking about this, you just listed a lot of people and a lot of processes. And the journalist, like the red alarm is going off in my head because I'm hearing like 5 different stories here that either happened for the individuals or something about this process. You don't have to go through all of them, but I am curious, when you list off this collection of people and places of this value chain, can you give us a sense of like of what you see the stories taking place there that interest you?
I mean, I guess it's twofold. The people are definitely always going to be the story. But for me, the barley is what I get really excited about. And like that same concept of, hearing someone talk and then all these ideas of stories come about, to me, it's research ideas and things that are questions. And the best thing about research to me is that a question is something that I can design a project around and consider the variables, and then with that research start to answer those questions. So to me, I guess chasing after the barley is where the story is, because that's what my research is involved with.
Jesse, if we think about what it means to chase after the barley, like Hannah's mentioning here, in terms of what that means for storytelling, for the people that you interact with regularly, give us a sense of what this idea of within the presence of this value chain, what does it mean when we think about the stories that exist here?
There is so many stories. I mean, it starts at the farm. It really, we go back to the farm and all the different things that the farmer is doing to make sure that they're growing this malt barley that's going to turn out at malting quality. I mean, farming malting barley in its own right is a difficult thing that not many farmers are skilled at, and it takes it can be a steep learning curve for new farmers. And so there's a lot of stories about challenges and learning curves there. And also just, it's about brewers connecting their products back to a place and to the people in that place.
Can you
Yeah, I would say too. Sorry, go ahead.
I was like, what's the financial ramifications of this? When we talk about craft malt, how big is this?
How big is craft malt? So I would say craft malt is not huge. It's very small. When you're looking at like the scale of how many breweries there are in the country versus how many malt houses, probably in North America we have around, I'm gonna say like 120-ish craft malt, like what we would consider craft or regional malt houses. And then there's probably a handful of these larger conglomerate, corporate style maltsters that are producing millions of pounds a year. But yeah, it's a very small industry, which makes sense because they're ingredient suppliers. They're not like a brewery where they're creating a final product for a consumer. Maltsters work with it's all business to business. So there's a lot of collaboration and working throughout the supply chain with different types of people. Everything from trucking companies to get the malt to where it needs to go to equipment makers and things like that.
Hannah, you had mentioned the idea of varieties. And when we're talking about the brewing of beer, the ways that might impact both our experience and then also what we think about it. For a lot of people here, we probably are familiar with, a Citra hop or a Cascade hop. What's a sexy barley?
I guess probably the two most well-known are either Maris Otter or another one called Golden Promise. They're two of the very rare ones that are named after the variety in itself. It's just a two-row or a pale malt, or those are names that reference the malting style. And so the concept of variety and how that plays into beer flavor is something that's fairly new. And the reason for that is that we know a lot of flavor comes from the malting process. And really, specifically, we've thought of that as being the kilning process. Your chocolate malt is going to be something that's spent more time at higher temperatures and creates darker colors. That's a kilning process that creates that. That's not anything to do with the variety. And so this concept has been so overpowering that we haven't really thought about things like variety and the process outside of kilning and how that plays into flavor, to the point where most malts that you would purchase, they don't list a variety. And that's something that's unique about craft malt, that the relationships that a brewer can have directly with their maltster, they can know what that variety is. They can know what the year to year variation, the struggles that might have happened in creating that particular lot of barley. They can learn what the variety is and what the characteristics are of how it malts, and what it might have for strong suits, or how to play into what the brewing process is to create something unique. But all of that's going to come currently from that communication, because you will usually not find variety listed on a certificate of analysis.
Yeah, so I know I've had some conversations with craft maltsters over the course of the last couple of years who have talked to me about the way that they're trying to find a way to explore a middle ground of these long-standing varieties, but either with new names, put them in new contexts for very specific flavors that brewers will be able to pull from them, that drinkers will be able to experience. Can you give us a sense of what's taking place in terms of, I guess, new varieties, or at least what's happening right now to expand this universe of what was previously just maybe a handful of barleys that were very popular?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Barley is somewhat unique compared to other crops. It tends to be the case that when a variety is released and it satisfies the agronomic needs, it tends to stick around for a really long time. So there's not a lot of turnover in the number of new varieties that are coming out. That doesn't mean that there aren't new varieties. There are a handful out there. But I would say the most important thing about it is not necessarily that you need to have some brand new variety, that it needs to be something that's really unique. I think what's more important is the relationship between the maltster and the brewer, to either work with the varieties that work for your region. So another unique thing about craft beer and craft malt is that those two things are fitting into communities across the country. That doesn't necessarily mean that barley grows in all of those places. So even though you're a brewer in northern Maine and you want local malt, that's not as easy as a brewer that's here in Montana, where we grow a lot of barley. So they're a lot more, the growers there need to find things that work for them. And sometimes that can be a challenge, because there aren't breeding programs spread around the country that are focused on trying to create varieties that will work really well for that region. So there needs to be that communication to understand where the challenges are and what will work for your area if local is something that's going to be important to you. And creating flavor means that you're pulling in from lots of different creative avenues. Variety can be one aspect of it. The malting process. So we're working on a project right now for the Brewers Association where we're considering flavor, and variety is one piece of that, but we're also thinking about the process in the level of modification, how we're changing that barley throughout the malting process, and then also considering the kiln. But all of those things interact and play together. And that's the kind of conversation that a brewer can have with his maltster to say, what works for us? This is, maybe a project that I have in mind. What can we work on together to create this end goal?
I just want to run this back to you, because what it sounds like to me, and again, I'm trying to think about this in terms of, that to me sounds like a really interesting story. It sounds like and you've mentioned this a couple of times, this relationship between a brewer and a maltster, the way that you're talking about it is almost a made to order scenario. Is that what you're describing?
And I mean, there's going to be nuance to that, but when you think about the history of what brewing was, it originally was that the brewer was the maltster. That relationship was internal. You thought about what your end product was and you brought it through that whole process. And so now that things are separated out a little bit more, it takes a bit more work to create that community. But that ultimately is the creative process, working together to find where the unique and what's going to work for your clients and for your product.
Hey, Jesse, I know you had mentioned over 100 craft maltsters that exist around the country. Jimmy, thank you very much. He mentions New York State has a New York State climate malting barley variety, Excelsior Gold. New York State motto, Excelsior. That will start
Yep.
in 2022.
Yep, Cornell just released that.
Jesse, can you give us a sense of maybe it's not well both where a lot of this action is happening in the country, whether or not that's the case, but also I'm curious where I guess maybe some of this new and exciting things are taking place when we're talking about where around the country where we have these craft maltsters, where they're setting up shop, and where they might be impacting the local brewing community there.
Yeah. So there's craft maltsters are pretty much all over the country. I would say there's a majority on the East Coast, but we're starting to get more and more popping up. And Michigan has quite a few. There's several popping up in the Midwest now. Texas has a couple. New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada has a few. So they're everywhere. And a lot of them, they're specializing in certain things. There's actually a few maltsters that also have distilleries that they then distill their own, they malt their own barley and then distill it into whiskey and make their own products. But yeah, I would say the most exciting things that I know of right now on craft malt are either on the West Coast, the East Coast, or right in the middle. Caleb Mashaki at Sugar Creek Malt House, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of and know of. He's like probably the who's who, the cool guy of craft malt at this minute. If you're into crazy Nordic style malts and smoked malts and things like that, it's super cool. There's some great stories coming out of Skagit Valley Malting over in Washington State. There's a wonderful collective of craft maltsters in the state of Colorado that are doing a lot of cool things with their local brewing scenes there and distilleries. And then in the Southeast, there's this Riverbend Malt, of course, has been around for quite a while and is doing a lot of cool stuff. But there's some other smaller maltsters popping up in the Southeast these days in places like Kentucky and Tennessee and South Carolina. And I hear there's going to be one in Georgia opening soon. So, it's a growing industry despite all the crazy challenges that have been thrown at us over this past year. So.
What have those challenges been?
Just with the pandemic and bars and restaurants and distilleries and breweries having to close, all that trickles back to the maltster and to the farmer. So you've seen maltsters go through sales slumps as well. Some have had to close their doors because their customers just they lost their customer base. But there's been a lot of just continual, everybody seemed to have slogged through it, and we've come out fairly unscathed. And I will say that it was a hard year for everybody, and we're really, really hopeful for the spring and a good crop. So
Sugar Creek, I know we had started the place asking about why people should care about malt. I think you maybe started to allude to it. Can you tell me why malt's cool?
Well, malt is cool for a number of reasons. I think one, just the huge impact that malt has, the craft malt has on its local community is really cool because there's been some research where they compared how much the economic impact of like a 6-pack of macro beer versus a 6-pack of local craft beer. This came out of Michigan actually, and a 6-pack of local craft beer made with local ingredients and brewed by a local brewery and using all local channels to get it to the consumer is 2.5 more times has a 2.5 more times larger economic impact than macro beer does on your local community. And that all trickles back down through into other businesses and in the community. So I think that's huge. The diversity of methods and products used within craft malting compared to the macro maltsters is just it's insane, the variety that you see in the methods. We have everything from traditional floor maltsters to, Caleb doing his Nordic style malting with a Norwegian style Steinhaus, using smoking to dry the malt, and making things like wind malt, which is using the wind to dry the malt. It's crazy.
What does
And
that
then,
do exactly when you talk about the wind drawing the malt? Jesse, if you want to answer this, but then Hannah, I actually would love if you have the insight from a scientific level.
the wind malt is like the old way they used to dry the malt, because they might not have had a kiln, so they would put it out on like a big, some kind of like big sheet or something, and let it dry in the sun. And it, but you didn't want it to be like but it had to get a good airflow too, because you wanted it to get, evenly dried out. So they've done some crazy things like that, like trying to recreate these traditional historical malts to, create a modern beer, because that traditional process created some, added some flavors to the malt through that experience. So.
Hannah, this may show up in some of the research you've done. When we talk about things like this, can you give us a sense of what these differences in malting do to the actual like structure and use of it?
Yeah, so to kind of just give a really brief overview of what the malting process is, we're taking a grain. It needs to be living grain, so that's also something unique to malting. Like wheat or something that's going to go into a flour. It doesn't matter if the grain is still living or not; it's just going to get milled up and make bread. For malting, it has to be a living grain, because the three basic kind of steps of malting are we're going to introduce that grain to water. So the purpose of that is to increase the moisture content of the grain. Essentially, we're tricking the grain into thinking it's kind of spring rain conditions. It's, ample conditions for growth time to start sprouting. So then we're going to start germinating the grain. So the second phase of malting after steeping is germination. And that germination phase is just allowing all the internal structures of the grain. So if you think of a barley kernel straight out of the field, if you tried to bite on it, like maybe an uncooked piece of rice or uncooked barley, it would be very tough. If you tried to bite on it, you might break a tooth. That germination process is breaking down. So you've got this barley kernel, and the internal structure of that is cell walls that give it rigidity. And then inside of that, there's protein that have little starch bundles all studded into it. And so the malting process, germination, is slowly working across the grain to break down those cell walls, to break down the protein matrix. And the goal is to expose those starches on the internal side of the grain just enough so that when we go into the kiln, we kind of arrest all those processes of changing so that the starch is preserved. And then that will be there for the brewing process for the yeast. The enzymes will break it into sugars, and then the yeast can ferment it. If we go too far in that germination process, the grain, its whole point is that it wants to grow a new plant. So it eventually will start to also break down those starches, create sugars, and then use that as an energy source to grow. But by kilning, we're arresting that process. And the kiln, where, I think of this wind malt, there's different ways that you can go about the kilning. If you go low and slow, you're going to allow that process to arrest gently, and the enzymes that are there will be preserved. The enzymes can only take so much temperature before they become denatured, and then they're not active. So when you think of different types of malt, you have low and slow, very light colors, very clean flavors. Those are going to be the low temperatures that have preserved those enzymes, and that's typically what you'll use as the large majority of your grist bill, because those enzymes are there to allow conversion to take place. On the other hand, if you go to high temperatures, you're going to start to denature those enzymes, but the trade-off is that you're also starting to allow the reactions to take place that create color and flavor. And so your more specialty type malts, you would use them in a smaller percentage of your overall grist bill, but because that flavor and color is fairly intense, you don't need a lot of it there to create whatever style it is that you're going after. So in the case of something like that wind malt, it's going to be a very unique type of malt in that not only are we going really, really, really low and slow, so we're going to preserve those enzymes very well, But we're not actually even going into a kiln where we're like high circulation of air or even a moderately low temperature. So we're probably actually going to see that germination phase is elongated a little bit throughout that initial drying phase, because it'll take a little while for that moisture to come out and for that modification process to really start to arrest. So it's going to be just a really, really unique malt that you're going to get out of a process like that.
So for both of you, this raises a very important question because, the things that we're talking about, like I had mentioned, I'm hearing in the value chain these aspects of stories of farmers, the way that things are taking place, the way that COVID has impacted them, the way COVID has impacted the relationship with brewers and craft maltsters. And we started from a place of why should we care? And I think one of the challenges that we as a group here as reporters and podcasters and all these things, translating this into a meaningful way for readers or listeners to a way that they would care about it is a real challenge. So I know we have some people who have joined us tonight who have written and covered malt before, so I would love you to chime in shortly when we get to the Q&A. Jesse, I think I'm leading up to a question for you here. When we talk about these challenges for us, where all this, like, to me, this sounds pretty cool, but I also know like there is a definite firewall that exists between trying to take these ideas and put them in a way that's going to be entertaining or interesting to an average drinker. What is it that you've found in your experience, whether it's dealing with the public or maybe even people in the industry, talking about malt? What have you found to be successful in a way of trying to engage in a way that kind of brings across your enthusiasm for it, but also explains it in maybe a good way about here's why or how you might want to talk about this to people who don't live in it?
When I'm talking to a beer drinker, typically I try to put it in a way that, like, it's kind of like, with the whole, know your farmer, know your food kind of thing. And it's the same thing. It's like, to know your beer, you need to know your brewer, but you might need to also go a little farther and know your maltster and then your farmer too, because, and I think there's a disconnect there for a lot of beer consumers that beer is an agricultural product. I mean, it truly is. It's everything that you make. These are all raw ingredients from farms, except for yeast, obviously, and water. But yeah, it's I think it's trying to put it in a context that's relatable, that's interesting, that people can understand where that person's coming from. And so talking about how those people are helping their communities, how they're going through the same kind of troubles and that we all go through, is worthwhile, and getting people to care about it.
Hannah, can you talk about terroir? This is something that I think the layman public knows about when it comes to something like wine. And in beer, this is still a relatively new thing to talk about when it comes to ingredients. What does that mean when we're talking about an ingredient like the malt that goes into a beer?
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. In other products, they've done a really great job of making this something that's commonly known. But in barley, going back to that concept of where flavor comes from, so much weight has been put on the kiln that these other concepts, variety, process, terroir, they've been very much overshadowed. In particular, I think terroir is maybe the least researched, the least known area of barley and malt right now. And partially that's just that it's a really challenging thing to study. Sensory in itself is a challenging way to research something. From the beer perspective, it's a little bit easier. There's a much more established group of folks who are very well versed in the sensory aspects of beer. So that definitely helps. In malt, we're taking a step back from the brewing process. So there's a method called the hot steep, and that's basically it's making a barley tea. It's kind of truncating some of the initial steps of what a brewing process would be, where you take milled malt and mix it with water, do a very short extraction, and then filter that to get a wort. And so there's sensory aspects that can go along with that hot steep. But one, getting panels that are very well trained. That method it's been a few years out now since it was approved through the ASBC, but getting panels that are well trained for it is one thing. Getting replicates to be able to really show that there are differences in something that's a very nuanced and potentially objective kind of science. But then the added challenge that, okay, if we find differences in the wort, is it actually going to translate through to the beer? And to really say that something is different in the brewing aspect, we have to prove it at both levels. So it adds another aspect to the research that we really have to do to be able to show these things, which makes it challenging. That doesn't mean that we don't do it. It just means that it takes us a while to work through it and think about the different aspects of it. So to give you kind of two examples. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start with the Brewers Association project, which isn't so much terroir, but that's talking about variety and modification and kilning, and kind of give you that example as a preamble to what we're looking at for terroir. So in this Brewers Association project, we want to ask that question: what is it that happens in malting that impacts flavor? So we've got a trial where we've got a handful of varieties, which those were narrowed down from originally a really big study of heirloom varieties. They had about 300 lines. We got chemical profiles on all of those and narrowed that into several kind of groupings within that. So for this Brewers Association trial, we have a handful of representative lines from each of those unique groupings. So we're starting with something that we believe is really diverse to begin with. We're kind of trying to give ourselves a good starting point to be able to prove that there's differences. With those varieties, we're then doing several different levels of modification. So when I talked about that germination process, and we're breaking down the structures within that grain, depending on how far we take that, if we go on the under-modified side of things, we're going to have a little bit more of that cell wall remaining. We're going to have more starch content there. Whereas if we go to the far end of it, we're really going to break down those cell walls. We're going to solubilize more of that protein. And we might even start taking some of that starch and breaking it into sugar. So that means that the composition of the grain itself, before it even gets into the kiln, is going to be different based on the genetics in the variety originally, how we've modified it and what composition is there going into the kiln, and then how we vary the kiln itself, where we know that there's lots of different flavor. All of those things coming together, we're interested in individually, but then the interactions. So with that project, we've malted everything. We've done malt quality testing, so we're always going to be interested in how it performs as a malt itself. And then this is a project between ourselves at Montana State University. We're also working with Colorado State University. And so we've sent those malts down to Colorado. They've done metabolomic and proteomic analysis so that we can get chemical profiles on all of these different malts. And they've also gone through and done sensory profiles on these so that we can get a really good picture of what the quality looks like, what the sensory attributes are, and what the chemical profiles are. And the long-term goal for that is that we could hope to start taking what we see for chemical profile and kind of pairing it up to what we find in the sensory profile, try and make some connections there. With that data, we'll try and narrow it down a little bit, and then we'll pick several of those to brew with, go through that same sensory process, and then try to see, the connections that we made between chemical and sensory and the wort. Do we see that travel through to the beer? So it's a lot of questions going into something, and then it takes a lot of steps and levels to really be able to tease out the answers to that question. So because there's so much involved in that, it means that's just from kind of the variety, malting, and brewing forward. But with terroir, we're taking that even a step further back. Now we're really talking about the land and how the impact of the environment, how that plays into it before we even get to all those things that I talked about for the Brewers Association study. And so that's one of the reasons that there's not a lot of research out there right now that can really concretely say yes or no whether terroir exists for barley. It, to me, makes 100% sense that of course it would make a difference, but being able to show that in a concrete way. So there's a project that we kind of started out with where maybe this will be something interesting. We really don't know. It actually came off of a presentation at the World Brewing Congress this past summer. There's a brewer, Aaron Justice from Ballast Point, and he brought up this concept that he was noticing from different malts that he was using, the water chemistry was being impacted from these malts. And so he had a handful of malts. They're from different parts of the world. You know, what he had on hand, some variable malts. And he went through and started testing the ionic composition of the worts from these malts, and he was finding differences. And to me, like you talked about hearing stories when people are talking about, you know, what they're interested in, that to me was like, oh my goodness, that is something concrete and measurable. We can make wort, we can measure ions and see what is physically there. That's a much more concrete way to see if this question, if we can find differences without going the sensory route, at least right away. And so I actually finished kind of the preliminary study for this today. We have a trial where we're growing a handful of varieties, and we've got it at a couple different locations and some different fertility rates. This is a trial that we do each year just to try and give some recommendations to growers as to what fertility rates might make sense for different varieties. But the great thing about this trial is that it's already got a couple locations, it's already got some different fertility variations, and there's a number of varieties in it, and we're already testing it. We're already creating wort that we could measure the composition on. And so over the past few days, we've gotten several different measures that we're looking at. So it's like chloride and magnesium and sodium and typical things that you might consider as a brewer when you're thinking of your water chemistry, and seeing if these different variations that we're looking at have any impact. And just off of the kind of like rough, quick look at it today, it looks like every angle that I try to test with this, whether it's the variety, the location, the fertility level, all of them, at least statistically, are showing differences. The question from there is, does that matter to brewers? You know, if you have a chloride level of 12 in one wort, a chloride level of 14 in the other, yeah, I can say statistically that they're different, but does that actually matter to the brewing process? Will that actually have an impact on the sensory qualities? Those are the next questions that we've got to ask, but I'm pretty excited about where we ended at today, so.
I just want to remind people that there will be a recording of this conversation, because Hannah, I'm pretty sure for those who are on the call, you just gave them a story idea. If you're curious about what's happening next in malt, even this tension that you're talking about, Hannah, of you're finding these objective, quantifiable differences, but then the next question is, well, does this actually matter to brewers?
Yeah.
That sounds like it's carrying a lot of weight.
I'm so excited about this because it's taking something that I'm, you know, very comfortable with on the malting side of things, but it's really pushing the boundaries of, you know, I'm newer to brewing, and it's something that I get to really dig into and learn a lot about, something that I think is really interesting. So I'm super excited about it.